This is the Person of Interest podcast, where we meet extraordinary people with a story to tell.
Well, welcome back to the Stockholm School of Economics here in Riga, where I'm delighted to welcome another guest who's hot-footed it up the steps on a day when the lifts aren't working as well, so that's real dedication to duty, who's just been giving a talk to some of the students here. Her name is Nina Vaskunlahti. Welcome, Nina.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
And she is Under-Secretary of State for Economic and Trade Affairs at the Finnish Foreign Ministry. I was doing a little bit of research into your background, and I was amazed and kind of pleased to see you've been there since 1984 at the Foreign Ministry.
I know, shock and horror, but that's a fact of life.
And so we'll get on to the last 30-odd years in a minute, but if we could start off with a little bit about your background. Where did you grow up? What were your educational experiences?
Right. Very good. Well, first of all, I grew up in a small village in the Finnish countryside, 160 kilometers north of Helsinki. And the driving instructions were 100 kilometers straight, then turn right and drive another 60. Yeah. And you find the village. And studied in Turku, at the Turku University. I did international politics, some international law, geography. So I think I had a bit of an idea what I would like to do when I grow up. And I had always thought about, either foreign ministry or some international organization. And as a teenager, I was very keen on development countries and development cooperation. And it it started rather early on. And I then applied. In those days, you had to apply to a training course that was selective. So that I think lasted for 3 months. And for the first 2 months, they kept really close eye on everybody. And then I think we were 30 who started. And in the first phase and second phase, we were 15. And then, I think out of those 15, 13 started at the ministry at the same time.
This almost sounds like a sort of military basic training.
It was a bit of a military basic training, but not as harsh, I would say. So mainly on diplomacy and politics and rhetorics and work. And then when I then heard that I could start at the ministry at the same time, I had applied for 2 other jobs that to be on the safe side, either for the Finnish broadcasting company to do international journalism, so I was pretty close to become somebody like you.
Lucky escape.
And then some business, but then I chose the foreign ministry, and no regrets.
Well, I'm interested in you saying it seems that from quite an early age you had this kind of international outlook, geography, international relations, politics. Where do you think that came from originally? Because often there's some sort of, maybe you read a book which fired something off, or there was a teacher or someone you met. I mean, it rarely just comes from nowhere.
No, that is true. I think I had a very good history teacher. And then I had a good teacher for languages. I'm not that great at languages, but they sort of opened up my world a little bit. As they used to go, away for the summer. It was quite a thing in those days, in 1970s, in a small village. Somebody went away for summer, to study abroad or study the language or whatever. I thought, well, that might be a fun thing to do. And then, so it's, 1 or 2 people, teachers who influenced me. And my parents were pretty sort of open-minded and far-reaching and always sort of encouraging. Today, I think one would say to think outside the box. And that's what we were encouraged to do. And then I started thinking outside the box and ended up first in Turku and then in Helsinki and then abroad.
And, I mean, Finland has quite a good reputation for equality, particularly gender equality, but was it quite male-dominated course?
It was very male-dominated. Not the course itself. It was a revolutionary course because out of those 13 people who started, 11 were women. But that caused an uproar at the ministry in mid-1980s. Sort of a leading bureaucrat saying that this is a scandal. It's scandalous. So many women are coming to the foreign ministry.
Scandalous there were so many.
Yes. So these women come and they get married and they get pregnant and then they leave the service and they don't want to serve abroad. Out of those 11, 10 are still there. And most of us are married with kids. And most of us are ambassadors and most of us are working well. That shows the attitude in 1980s. What was sort of I remember thinking how odd that was, because I was brought up in a very, very sort of egalitarian way in my family, etc. And I thought, how odd that they say these things, but it was sort of a, that was it. Today, if you said that, it would be Me Too harassment, basically.
Well, it's completely flipped around, hasn't
yes,
it?
it has totally flipped around in 35 years.
But it's interesting that, so the argument they made was that basically it wouldn't be worth the investment in you.
Yes, basically, yes.
Rather than that you weren't capable, it would just be like, we won't...
So you just dismiss somebody because she happens to be a young woman, which is not the case anymore. And as a matter of fact, the Finnish foreign ministry, it's sort of getting a bit, and I say this very frankly, it's getting a bit too sort of women-dominated as well. So it has turned very much the other way around. Because I personally believe when we get sort of rough half and half, that is fine, because societies are half and half, and I do hope that will be reflected also in workplaces.
And do you think that it was maybe the example of people like you that's encouraged these much greater numbers of women to look for a diplomatic career?
I think it has. Because I sort of I believed in examples and sort of enabling environment, and I have been trying to, be an example. That sounds very sort of high-nosed, but I know it can make a difference. And I have served in India. I've served in Turkey. I've been to the remotest places in these two countries, and I have discussed with thousands, hundreds of girls and young women, and told them how things are possible, and how women can, how also girls can sort of scream and jump, and that they don't have to be all sort of nice and tidy all the time.
Yeah.
But there's a world outside waiting for them.
Yes, but it doesn't seem sort of high-nosed, as you put it, at all. I mean, it must be quite a refreshing and practical example for someone in, say, a remote Turkish village where she hasn't had any opportunity for education to just say, well, actually, this woman's an ambassador. It is possible.
Yes, that is true. I mean, and we had a female president in Finland. And I mean, Mrs. Tarja Halonen, and she also served as an example. And I think the proof of the pudding is sort of a 5-year-old girl saying, I can become a president, I can become a prime minister, I can become a minister of defense. So examples do serve a purpose.
Well, the other thing that I think is particularly interesting about 70s and 80s Finland and diplomacy and world of politics is we're still in the Cold War era, and Finland had a very sort of specific, very characteristic role that it had carved out for itself as, not quite aligned with the US or Russia, but a place where maybe they could talk. Sorry, Soviet Union rather than Russia, but a place where they could kind of have some sort of dialogue. I mean, within the diplomatic service, it must have been a slightly different slant on things that you got than other countries, perhaps.
It was maybe a different slant in those days. But in those days, I was also a very young diplomat, and let's say that I might not have been in the core of the matters in late 1980s, 1990s. But of course, I remember how things were done. But what has always been, important for Finland, we have always been one of the Nordic countries, and Nordic cooperation has been very important for us. And Finland is a bilingual country. Swedish and Finnish are both official languages, and I've always been a very keen sort of Nordist and for more than one official language, because like in our case, Swedish opened the way to Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, because those languages belong to the same linguistic family. And also, I think we found then, and we do have now, a way to live with our neighbor and neighbors. And we share a common border around 1,300 kilometers with Russia. Russia will remain there forever. We will remain forever where we are. And then you just have to find a modus vivendi, and I'm quite proud of the way we have done it. I mean, we fought a bitter war against the Soviet Union. We lost, but we never lost our independence. And we have ever cherished that ever since. And then another important moment, of course, came in the 1990s when we decided to join the European Free Trade Area, and then we had a referendum concerning whether to join then European communities or not. And I remember when I voted, for me it was a very clear yes. And why was the clear yes? It was to vote Finland to the group of countries that we naturally belong to, Western democracies. And that's where we are at the moment.
And then I guess the next big, I mean, I don't want to go into a potted history of Finland or whatever, but I'm imagining that attitudes changed, and particularly if you have like trade responsibilities, when we had the huge boom of, Nokia and Finland becoming, a major global economic player, maybe in a way that it hadn't previously. It was kind of quite a stable and what these days they would call sustainable economy, right?
Yeah.
But then it suddenly expanded massively. I mean, did that change the mindset as well? Was there the onus to kind of sell?
Well, I think that changed the mindset to a certain extent. People became a bit more assertive. And we sort of realized that small countries can make it not only politically but also from the economic point of view. And Nokia was also, to a certain extent, a result of our education and training system. Equal opportunities, a free basic education, free universities, money put in research and development. And we have always also highly appreciated engineering and engineering sciences. And voila, there we were with and Nokia. And of course, then we all know Nokia sort of, I wouldn't say it sort of collapsed, but it sort of led its leading position in the handmade devices. And that was a shock to the system. But that also showed us that as a result, many little Nokias have come up, lots of startups, and Finland is now one of the leading countries of startups in Europe. But that also showed us, never ever really, trust on one or two things, but do many things, diversify, and really invest in further in education and research.
And so, sort of turning to the subject of what you were talking about today at SSE, I believe there was a particular emphasis on trade wars and kind of threats to trade, which maybe are cropping up, which people, to an extent, had maybe thought were a thing of the past, but they're very definitely not. Could you just give us a little bit of a resume of what you were talking to the students about?
Yes, it was an interesting morning we had, because the world we have at the moment is different from the world we had 10 years ago. And in particular, when we think of trade and trade based on multilateral system, multilateral negotiations, rules-based world order, respect for international institutions, respect for WTO, that has all changed. And now there are much more questioning, for instance, questions about globalization. What does globalization mean for us? Is globalization for better or for worse? And there seems to be sort of a anti-globalization feeling that sort of has an impact on trade deals and trade arrangements that we make. We in the United States, there's very, very strong feeling this sort of America first, which means that they want to negotiate on their terms and they want to have benefits for themselves, not really caring, what happens to the other party or to the rest. We've also seen the rise of China that was much faster, much quicker than any of us realized. And so all that somehow put together, and then, rise of other countries, who feel that the rules and regulations were agreed and made during times when they were not really taken into account, and they are now sort of, demanding their share, which it's fair to demand your share. I'm not against that, but at the same time, I do believe that we would all be better off if we were able to agree on the rules of the game. And now the rules of the game seem to be a bit lost. And that sort of ends up, sort of separate negotiations, separate discussions, and instead of multilateral framework, they're sort of bilateral or regional. And they might be sort of beneficial for those two bilateral, concerned or regions concerned, but what is the impact on the whole world? And then at the same time, when we talk about globalized world, we talk about global value chains, which means that we are so dependent on each other. Whatever, for instance, the trade war situation between US and China, it has an impact on us. sooner or later, and normally sooner, when we talk about tariffs. And for instance, the deal that U.S. and China recently made some 2 months ago, it includes a chapter on agricultural products and exported from the United States to China. And China has given sort of blanco import permits for American meat and poultry, you name it. And Finland, for instance, we have negotiated now for years, to get permits for some Finnish meat products to the Chinese market. And so it's quite a blow to us.
And so, I mean, how does this get resolved then? Because on the one hand, everyone seems to be talking about the need for free trade, but at the same time, I mean, I guess, America is kind of the most obvious example, traditional champion of free trade, but at the same time as demanding free trade from everyone else, actually instigating sort of quite protectionist policies and tariffs in a lot of ways. So is a sort of redrawing of the rules, maybe including these countries which have felt excluded in the past, necessary? Or do we need to just sort of go back to the original principles and kind of re-educate everyone as to what's supposed to be happening?
I think the answer is split in the both. I don't think we can go. Let's say we have to go back to the basics in a way that we all agree that we negotiate, that we all negotiate together, and then we have to sort of rewrite the rules a little bit, because what was agreed maybe in some 20-30 years ago in the WTO context might not be totally applicable to other countries who are now sort of stronger than they were before and who are more,
I guess, particularly in the digital
world. And then we have new challenges. We have digital trade, we have e-commerce, you name it. We have emerging countries. We talk about China plays a different role today than it played 15 or 20 years ago. So that's the thing. We need reform. Be it reform of WTO, be it reform how we sort of negotiate. That we need, but we need to agree that we start the reform. And that, I think, is one of the biggest challenges that we have at the moment, to get everybody to agree that we need a reform, that we do it together. And in that respect, the WTO ministerial meeting in Kazakhstan, which is scheduled to take place in June, mid-June this year, is very important. That, will the member states be able, the WTO member states, will they be able to agree that we start reform talks together and not separately?
And I mean, Finland as a member of the European Union, but also individually, I mean, it's quite a good reputation in terms of worker rights, social welfare, high standards. How do we incorporate that into, say, discussions with China, where as well as the economic fact of China being able to make goods very cheaply because of bad conditions? I mean, how can we put that back on the table rather than just say, basically it would be the equivalent of just turning a blind eye, wouldn't it? It would be like, we don't care what happens there as long as we get our cheap T-shirts from there. But is there an imperative still to have a moral aspect to this? Or
I would say there is an imperative to have a moral aspect on this. And we also have to remember that when you talk about environmental issues, climate issues, I mean, most of us have signed the Paris Agreement. All of us have agreed to Sustainable Development Goals. Most of us are members of the ILO, etc. So the international framework is there. And, most countries of the world and countries we are talking about are members or members of this organization or signatory parties to different agreements. So now the thing is that you sort of also have to implement what you have once signed. And that seems to be the complicated thing for all. And and the cheap T-shirt from China, Vietnam, whatever. I think we also have very conscious consumers nowadays. They want to know where the T-shirt comes from and how much has been paid for the lady by or the man by the sewing machine. So, but there are no simple answers. It is a very complicated. The principle is there, how to get there, and how far to push. And then if I'm really sort of frank and open here, of course, European Union has a bit of a sort of reputation being a bit too demanding, a bit too high-nosed, that this is what we want, and all this is good for our consumers. But then on the other hand, these are the things and values we believe in. But negotiation is negotiation. So we have a long way to go, I would say. And I was just, discussing with the rector of the Stockholm School of Economics, saying that even though times are challenging, these are terribly interesting times because you really have to sort of think of solutions and think outside the box as well to a certain extent to make way forward. And what you said earlier about the digitalization, I mean, that is totally something it's not too late, but we are there. We have to decide what we want to do about it. Talking about it, that has to link with intellectual property and who owns the data and artificial intelligence. How to use that for the benefit of us and not to the detriment. So that's the thing, because we are struggling with the basics, and then we have new issues that we need to address.
I think that's a very good point you make. In a sense, we're kind of asking the basic questions again of what these terms like trade or values actually mean, maybe in a way that we took them for granted. But kind of on that topic, could I ask you, as a layman who's not an economist or a diplomat, how do you define a trade war? So what's the difference between, say, protectionist measures have been instigated, certain tariffs have been introduced, and what's the point at which you say this is a trade war and presumably things get a bit more serious? Or is it just degrees?
How to define a trade war? It's not very easy. In a way, one can define the trade war is when you sort of one-sidedly decide to increase tariffs and you sort of, just give them as given to the other side and you sort of operate outside the jointly agreed rules of the game.
So it's like a sort of selfishness rather than like a punitive necessarily.
It's more selfish than punitive, because also increasing tariffs for aluminium coming from China to the United States makes steel in US much more expensive than it was before. It sort of looks good at the beginning, but it's sort of a self-inflicting damage in the end. And
then I guess there must also then, for it to qualify as a war, then there's like some reciprocating measure on the other side. Yeah?
Reciprocating measure on the other side, tit for tat, you increase, I increase, you increase, I increase. And then the thing is, then what?
Yeah, well, exactly, that was my next question. So how do you break that cycle?
How do you break that cycle? Will the industry react? Will people react? Will the electorate react at some point? If you sort of see that, hey, this is not to my benefit after all.
So I guess the point at which there's a tipping point then at which the action or the aggressive action becomes no longer worth it, whether you say as it's politically or economically, people can't buy a certain product.
Yeah, exactly. You sort of you come to a point when you realize that.
And I believe you touched in your presentation on the potential impact of the COVID-19 coronavirus as well. I mean, how do you see? As we speak, we're still in early March, and so it's possible that by the time this comes out, things will be a bit different. But what's your take on it?
Yes, as you said, we are still at early stage, and it's difficult to predict what happens. But the facts, as we both know, is that it's spreading a bit faster than we thought. China was not able to contain it in China. Also, the good thing is that the figures are going down in China. They are not very, very high in the rest of the world, but it's now spread in 80 countries, which means that it is on its way and it will touch, all the countries in the end. There was some recent assessment of the OECD, and in the best case, the impact would be 0.5% minus to the to economic growth. At worst, it could be 2.5% minus. This is what the OECD is saying.
This is amongst OECD countries.
Well, it's OECD. It's global. Global. It's an assessment made by the OECD, but touches everybody, not only Europe, and it has already had an impact on value chains. China being the factory and the component producer of the world. And then Hubei, where it all started, the factories have been closed, components have not made their way, out of China. customs, logistics, everything is being impacted, and so we are seeing the results. And then also, when we think of producing medicaments, China and India. I mean, China has the biggest factories and laboratories, or it has sort of ingredients for many medicines in the world. So worrisome as well, and like we were discussing with some people, why wasn't this not sort of seen beforehand? Well, easy peasy, China is doing that and whatever. And now we're in the situation where they have a monopoly, almost.
And, well, do you I mean, it's a medical emergency or a medical situation, but do you think this could have an impact on, say, reducing enthusiasm for globalization, or making countries look again at almost like Cold War situation where we have to have contingencies for self-sufficiency and all this kind of stuff?
Yes. I mean, there is tendency, of course, everybody must have contingency plans. Yes, there is an effect to that extent. And that is very worrisome, because I've never believed in protectionism. I never believed in only turning inwards. And I am afraid that some extreme elements might use the situation as an extreme to say, okay, see, this is what globalization does to us. We better close our borders and protect ourselves. Bad news. Overall, I think that it will be a dent, but the world will sort of recover from this as well.
And we better finish on a high, though.
Okay, let's do that.
So what can we look forward to coming out of Finland in the next few years as economic good news? Because Finland is the one country where every week, I think it is, in my inbox, I get an email. I can't remember where I subscribe to it, saying, good news from Finland. And they send me a list of, startups which have been successful or awards which have been won. And one part of me is like, oh, look, it's the email again. But occasionally I do click on it and think, and look at the other things in my inbox and think, it does make a bit of a difference. So what good news can we look at coming out of Finland?
I think there will be more startups coming from Finland. That will be beneficial for trade and for consumers. I just read Financial Times, and there's a Finnish company called Volt that was established by a young chap in his late 20s. And it's a platform economy about sort of, delivering food from restaurants to the consumers. And you
can see them all over Riga already. Actually.
That's right. You can, and it has grown in a couple of years, from nothing to what it is at the moment. So more things like more companies like that, I think will be coming up. I think you will be seeing very interesting. Automatic vessels coming from Finland. I think you will be seeing interesting clean solutions for clean technologies, how to save the planet, if I'm really optimistic, coming from Finland. And Finland will remain a nice country to visit. 80% is covered by forest, 10% is covered by water, and we live on 10%. So when you want silence and peace of mind, come to Finland.
Well, and I can add into the mix as well, definitely the maker of the best winter tyres, as someone who drives Latvian roads.
That is very true. We just need the winter back at the moment.
Well, Nina, thank you very much for joining me today. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. This podcast was produced by SSC Riga. If you'd like to learn more about the topic, visit the open course schedule at SSC Riga Executive Education. For more podcasts, find us on Spotify, iTunes, or the platform of your choice. Remember, share this episode with your friends and colleagues.